Today's webinar is entitled Immigration Update, Visa Options for Europeans and Canadians in the age of COVID-19 and in the light of recent developments, and is brought to you by the European American Chamber of Commerce, where Europeans and Americans. I'm Todd Schwartz. I'm Executive Director of the Cincinnati chapter of the European American Chamber of Commerce, and I'll be your host today. We have over 100 people registered for our event from across Europe and North America, so I'm sure we're going to have a vibrant transatlantic and international discussion. One quick disclaimer, please note that all comments and opinions presented by our speakers today are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the European American Chamber of Commerce or its members. And now I will introduce Yvonne Bendigo-Rothschild. She is my counterpart, serving as Executive Director of the New York chapter of the EACC, and she will introduce our topic and panelists. Yvonne, over to you.
Thank you, Todd, and good morning, everyone. Over the last couple of years, with almost constant changes in immigration regulation, this topic has become a series. For the EACC, I always said almost the first 10 years of my reign at EACC New York, we've never done an immigration program, and we've done, I think, 3 or 4 over the last 3 years. Our panel will offer an update on U.S. immigration and how the new changes affect individuals and businesses and their ability to conduct business in the United States. We will also address practical issues, and we will look at the Canadian angle, as there seems to be a trend by companies starting operations or operating in the US via Canada. So we decided to add a Canadian firm to the conversation as well. And we also will address what changed with COVID in terms of travel restrictions and quarantine measures that affect business travelers. Our speakers include Francis Tourigny. He's with EXEO attorneys based in Canada, Jorge Lopez with Lippler Mendelssohn, Gerland Wiskirchen with CMS based in Germany, and Ray Rackman. He is with HSBC and will bring the corporate aspects of this issue to the table here today at the panel. One note, operationally, since webinars don't allow you to meet in person, we offer our members to connect with the panelists and with other participants of this webinar after the event. You will get a list with everybody who attended, and you can reach out to us and we will connect you with anybody you would like to follow up with. Ray will start the discussion and offer a view from the corporate perspective to explain how personnel planning and corporate mobility is affected by all of this. And with that, Ray, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Yes, Yvonne said, my name is Ray Rackham. I'm the Global Head of Immigration for HSBC. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and thank you to the European American Chamber of Commerce for the invitation. HSBC set up a separate global borders and immigration team to sit within its mobility practice in 2014. And since then, we've designed and implemented a migratory policy architecture and an operational environment within the business for short-term migrants, those who travel for less than 90 days, medium-term, what we would usually call our assignee or secondee population, and then long-term, local hires of nationals who are working in a country to which they aren't national. So that pretty much, that is our bread and butter work. How do we move people around the world for short, medium, and long term? But to put this into some context, our program provides immigration strategic compliance and all of the ancillary support in that world to 90% of HSBC's 235,000 strong population, and 80% of its short-term business travel population. In other words, each year we work with over 6,000 to 8,000 work permits and 80 to 120,000 short-term business travel assessments. to make sure that our employees travel around the world legally, compliantly, and within the auspices of each separate immigration regime in over 42 countries. Our mission statement is to enable significant cost reduction to the bank while exploring and developing a migratory strategy against an increasingly volatile geopolitical backdrop, impacting on our international workforce. Now, I'm just pulling up that mission statement because this was a statement that was recalibrated in November 2019. Exploring and developing migratory strategy against an increasingly volatile geopolitical backdrop. It could have almost been written as an immigration response to the COVID-19 international crisis that has not only enveloped the world, but has also sent shockwaves across the border and immigration regimes of almost every country worldwide. What this has specifically meant for HSBC's more mature borders and immigration program is a pivot and refocus to COVID, but also keeping in line and keeping at the forefront of our minds our mission statement. We must we must ensure employee safety. We must ensure a reputational risk to the bank, negotiations with separate governments to ensure immigration and post-COVID-19 compliance is adhered to for our international workforce. We must also ensure business continuity, ensuring all employees have the legal right to work in the current location and maintain that right to work. We have to also start to think about our future state, because we anticipate there will be 5 broad phases of immigration response to COVID-19. And much of the world is now entering the latter stages of that phased approach. First, there was the emergence, where individual country restrictions to individuals traveling from the most highly or heavily impacted areas. Then stages 2 and 3 were pretty much interlinked. A fast prevalence period in stage 2, where there were more wider scale restrictions, and then a peak period where wholesale closures of visa application centres, country lockdown, closure of borders, the introduction and emergence of quarantine for those who were admitted, and delays in processing. Now we find ourselves globally moving toward a period of subsiding in some cases, resurgence in others, but hopefully heading, at least in the immigration world, to some form of new normal, which will be the final phase of this. The likely scenarios for HSBC would be border restrictions lifted and then reimposed, maybe lifted again, mandatory quarantine, different rules worldwide for different employees traveling to different locations, heightened visa issuance and admission criteria, governments embarking on wholesale visa verification. And I'm talking about those individuals who found themselves stranded and maybe outside of the usual confines and the obligations and rights of their visa. There may be increased protectionism of the resident labour market. Immigration policy may be driven by the economic impact of the last 6 months and the stimulus plans the governments have put in place. Opening new routes to address particular immigration gaps might even be an opportunity. And absolutely and definitely the advent of digitization. Now again, none of this is new, and that's because immigration has been politicized quite significantly over the last 15 years, worldwide, none so more than in the United States. And HSBC's view here is to make sure that HSBC as an organization has the best advice, the best strategy, and the best ability to protect its employees and the organization. I'm absolutely fascinated to hear what the speakers have to say today, particularly as in the US in particular, immigration has been at the forefront of newspaper headlines with the various executive orders and clarifications, but also immigration will remain at the forefront of international headlines for some time to come. So Yvonne, I'm going to hand it back over to you now, but I'm just very delighted to be here and part of this panel.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. It should come as no surprise that the immigration processing in the United States is somewhat become problematic in the last, let's say, 6 months, and for me personally, for the last 3 years. And as we speak right now, there's almost daily updates and daily consequences for some of the things that Ray was mentioning. Just this morning, I was dealing with a senior executive for a fairly large international operation that is pretty much stuck in Italy now for the last few months as a result of the restrictions related to the Schengen visa relationships and situations. And maybe it might be a good idea as a starting point to make sure folks in this panel understand what kind of restrictions we're dealing with, because there's some that actually cross-pollinate themselves. First of all, as far as the ones that relate to the European market, because I'm not talking about the other markets, are going to be the Schengen visa restrictions that started in March 11th. Those basically are dealing with individuals coming specifically from Schengen-related countries for a set defined period of time. The other one is the UK and Ireland Proclamation that went into effect on March 14th. That basically applies to those countries. And again, it's for individuals coming from those countries. It's not necessarily visa-oriented or status-oriented. And then lastly, the one that's occurred within the last few days is really the visa entry restriction. And just that basically deals with certain visa categories, the J, the L, and basically the overall aspects of the H1B, L1, J visa categories are the most prominent ones that are affected by that restriction. And just yesterday, a lawsuit was filed in the United States in the Northern District of California contesting the U.S. government's position on being to restrict those entries into the United States. Because the ramifications are quite extreme. The rationale for it was not really as much COVID directly as economically directed, but at the end of the day, it is affecting the economic consequences of both U.S. and European companies overall. But again, just to talk a little bit about what we're seeing effectively is we're seeing senior executives that are basically stuck outside the United States for defined periods of time and are not able to enter the United States to meet their internal commercial objectives of the company and their obligations. I know I want to make this more interactive, but I just want to do that intro in reference to the kind of lay of the land of what's going on in the U.S. right now. And with that, maybe I can give it to Francis so we can then start talking about cross-pollination issues.
Good. Thank you very much for the opportunity to give the Canadian angle. Of course, in Canada, we have a totally different approach. It's not as politicized. We don't target specific countries. So, of course, the approach evolved throughout the months, throughout the COVID crisis. But basically, the border is still closed to everyone, but there are many exceptions. So we can talk about them maybe a little later, but basically, of course, all Canadian citizens, all permanent residents of Canada can come to Canada without a problem. But we have also other exceptions. For example, all people with a visa, work visa, can enter Canada without a problem. All students also can come. And we also have exceptions for people who come for, I would say, essential reasons. So basically, it gives room to a bit of creativity. You basically need that you're not coming to have fun. It's basically what you need to prove. So a lot of reasons can come up to mind. If someone, for example, wants to take care of someone close to them, you just need to document the whole thing very thoroughly. But all this to say that we have a complete different approach than the United States. It's very, very completely different. So there are, many exceptions, and we can talk about them a little later. But basically, all people with a work permits, all people who come to also visit their family members, close family members can still come. So it gives a total different approach to Canada.
So in Europe, we have two issues. One is the internal traveling opportunities, and then the question of external travel from especially the US to the EU and vice versa. Let me start with the second one. There's a gradual lifting of the restrictions on external borders, and the European Union has published a list of countries that are exempt from travel restrictions. Every 14 days, this list will be updated. To put the main important matter first, the US is not on the list. The list is based on purely scientific questions, such as what is the number of new cases over the last 14 days, and is this number about the same as on average in the EU? And has there been a trend over the last 14 days that new cases are decreasing? And then the third issue to be taken into account is the government really taking care to decrease new cases such as testing, surveillance, contact tracing, and so forth. So these are the criteria for coming on the list. So far, about 13, 14 countries are on the list. It's a crude, interesting mixture of countries, and probably it's difficult for you to understand. It starts with Algeria, Japan is on the list, Canada is on the list, Australia is on the list, but also countries such as South Korea and even China is on the list again. So these are the good countries that have no travel restrictions coming into the European Union. Other countries where there is a general travel restrictions continue to apply these restrictions unless certain people would like to travel and they are exempt. I've put them on the list. It's either EU citizens and their family members, so nobody is stuck abroad. Everybody can return to the EU. Also, long-term EU residents having a specific status can come to the EU anytime. And then the main important group are travelers with essential functions. And Todd, I'd like you to switch to the next slide, please. Because these essential functions are either healthcare professionals, people who travel for more or less mandatory family reasons, such as a burial or a wedding, and then students. I'm pretty sure we'll talk about students from an American perspective, but these are typically those who are allowed to come to the EU. There are other groups such as diplomats and also highly qualified third country workers. That can be interesting for multinational corporations. If it's absolutely necessary from an employment point of view, for economic reasons, or that the work cannot be postponed or performed abroad, that these people can be sent to the EU without further delay. However, in many countries, there is still the threshold of a 14-day quarantine if you come from a country of a negative list. So in our case, from the US. So the only country that makes an exception is Denmark. You can come anytime if it's for business purposes. I'm not sure if that's being used a lot. I checked today the flight schedule from Frankfurt, as you know, one of the busiest airports in Europe. There's one flight going to the US to New York every day. So it seems that there are not that many people with essential functions traveling either to the US or coming from the US to the EU at the moment. Just to give you a taste for the internal traveling, internal border controls within the EU have been lifted gradually over the last weeks. So the freedom of traveling and taking residence within the EU is preserved again. And if you want to check what you need specifically in a given case, you should check out the link Reopen EU, and it gives it's a very good information platform for either business travelers or tourists.
If I may chime in for a second, what I've been hearing is that certain production lines haven't been opened because machines can't be brought to the United States because the European engineer can't come along. And that seems to be I mean, I've heard that now numerous times. And also the issue seems to be the CEO of companies being stuck in Europe. We have within the EACC network a couple of CEOs that have not been at their US office for months now because they're stuck, they have an L visa or, and they're stuck in Europe or elsewhere. And, you know, I would like to hear from both Jorge and Francis how that, Francis, if this is an issue in Canada, and Jorge, how are your clients addressing this issue?
Francis, you want to start with that, and then I'll build on yours?
Go ahead, please. Go ahead.
Okay, sure. I mean, basically right now, I mean, I heard the comment that was being made about how Europe is concentrating on reopening borders and getting back to normalcy. It's almost like the United States is going in the opposite direction. We're trying to figure out how to close our borders. You know, and the premise is based upon trying to help the economy as well as prevent the dissemination of the COVID virus, which is already here, and that's very little we can do about that. But I think the biggest frustration is, you know, just last week on July 16th, the Department of State came up with basically rules regarding whether or not there was going to be certain categories of national interest waivers available for the folks such as the CEOs and the chief executives that you're mentioning. But I will tell you in practice, in application, they really restricted to humanitarian rationales and health-related rationales, business-related reasons as to basically we need the operations of our company to have the CEO physically present in our office in New York are not being accepted as rationales for sustaining a national interest waiver under the whether it's under the Schengen or in this case also as well as the provisions regarding the processes for the newly created visa restriction entries. So it is a frustrating process, and I think some of the communications that I'm having just right before this call with the CFO of an extremely large company that is known very well, that they basically have, we have to tell them, you really can't go to Europe, because if you go to Europe, I can't guarantee under the present environment that you're going to be coming back within 2 weeks. You may have to have a prolonged vacation that you may not want to have, or it may not be feasible for you. That's becomes a practicality of how we're needing to manage this process right now. And that is something that is very frustrating to folks overall.
Yeah, if I may, we don't have that problem in Canada. As I was telling you earlier, anyone with a valid work visa can enter Canada. So it's really, so that's why a lot of, we've seen a big surge in demand from, companies that were thinking of opening branches in the US, but since they cannot send their CEOs or their employees, they decided to come to Canada because we just don't have that restriction. However, there's a very quite severe, I would say, obligation to present a quarantine plan. You basically need to say where you're going to buy your groceries, where you're going to stay, how will you get home. You need to provide a valid address. And actually authorities, what I hear is that they are checking, they are coming to your door to see if you're really in quarantine. And the fine can be up to $750,000 Canadian. I mean, we didn't see that apply yet, but they are taking that very seriously. So yes, the foreign workers can come, but you need to come up with a very detailed quarantine plan.
Do we want to address e-visas as well? Are there any changes with those recently?
Well, maybe I'll start tackling that from a U.S. perspective, and that is the e-visas is not directly restricted by any of the recent presidential proclamations in the United States. So it is really exempted, whether we're talking about an E2 based upon Treaty of Commerce and Trade, or we're talking about E3s for Australian nationals. So those are under the normal protocols. The issue with the e-visas is a side issue, because we found when we're dealing with Europeans, we're dealing with two criterions. We're now dealing with the most recent visa restricted, the the J visa categories, H1B, H2B, by the way, L1, and the H1B, the J1. Those are visa specific. But even if you overcome, let's say you're an E-visa executive and you're European and you're in Europe, you're still needing to deal with the Schengen visa restriction, and so that's where you've got to start becoming creative. Do I send my executive for 14 days to Croatia, which is not a Schengen country, and then enter the United States? That becomes an option. But you can't be coming directly from the EU or Schengen visa country and basically directly to the United States unless you've been outside the Schengen area for 14 days.
Which is an interesting option. Does that mean you can go through one of the Caribbean islands and then go into the United States? That's what I heard.
That's actually you're right, and I actually confirmed that because we were discussing that the other day. Yes, and actually specifically under the Ireland-UK treaty restriction, they basically specifically say that outerlying possessions are not included in that provision. It was really mute and not really addressed in reference to the Schengen visa restrictions. But in application, it is being applied the same way. So places like Aruba, for example, Martinique, those are basically considered outerlying possessions, not part of the Schengen visa treaty countries, and therefore would be allowed to basically, after parking yourselves there for 14 days, into the United States. And it's a little bit more stomachable to hang out for 14 days in Aruba than in some other countries.
Yeah, well, I know a couple of clients who now sent their CEOs who have to do business in the United States for vacation to Aruba in the hope that they can enter the United States. But there seem to be some hurdles to be sure to enter the U.S., to cross the U.S. border. Still.
Yes, there are, and it is basically a practical consideration. In some states, New York, for example, are becoming a little bit more forceful in their 14-day quarantine period for folks that are coming in from certain parts of the, even internal U.S., as well as outside the United States as well. So there's a little bit more control, but that is very jurisdictional and process flow driven.
Yep.
Are you sure that Martinique is part of that? Because I remember when I entered Martinique, I wanted to have a stamp in my passport, and the immigration officer told me, Madame, Schengen, when I came with my European passport. So I'm not sure that Martinique is part of that. We also heard that, especially on the British Virgin Islands, there is a major pushback similar to what is happening in Bermuda, who initially offered, people to park there because, as I explained to my own mother, I need to be in the time zone. So working from Germany is not the same thing for me as working from New York because I'm 6 hours behind. So
I can tell you a story. My son should be based in Boulder, and he's now leading his team from Germany. And he would typically start the day at 2 p.m. and end at 2 a.m. It's quite challenging here in one household, I can tell you. It's not the same.
And Ray, that is massively affecting your planning and, especially the quarantine. Like you said, you can't send anybody for a meeting, to meet a private client, to meet a business partner. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, and I think the short answer is that we can't deal with it at the moment, where you have individuals who want to travel for business for, 2 days, even a day, under the old business visit rules. Very important client meeting. Quarantine at the moment just does not make that possible in many locations. But we mustn't also forget that in some locations, the borders still remain closed. And I think the problem that we have is the finding the new ways of working is going to dictate how speedily some of our immigration practices and some of the rules that we have around immigration, how speedily they're going to change. And I think the short answer is that for those who used to take for granted the ability to travel around the world, almost follow the sun, is impossible at the moment. We have identified a whole number of people that have exactly the same problems as Galen and Yvonne, you've explained earlier. The thing with the immigration piece and people who are stranded or not able to return to work location is that then there are a whole other number of compliance issues that follow that too, particularly around tax, for example. So it has been very, very difficult. And for all organisations to have good grasp of your data, know where people are and what they're doing, was very useful to us at HSBC.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that, how is that affecting strategic visa planning? Because I was always so we started with trouble, having trouble with the H1Bs, and then, people switched to L visas as a new panacea. Now an L visa is really a bad visa, as it turns out, because you're not as flexible as someone like me with a green card in terms of getting exceptions, or like an E-visa. When the borders closed in the United States, there was a mad rush of people coming in, and the L visas are the ones who are stuck outside. How do you plan that as you're internally as a company? It may influence your hiring decision if you can, what kind of visa you can get from somebody.
Yeah, it does influence the hiring decisions, but you have to then also think very carefully around hiring decisions based on the ability to obtain a visa, given the prevailing possible racial discrimination that also entails. I think what we have now is very much a perfect storm for a lot of various different compliance problems that are predicated and accepted by the fact that countries are changing their immigration rules at a speed that we haven't seen before, and at a rate, and consistent rate we haven't seen before. I think that strategic immigration planning this year has gone out of the window. There isn't a huge amount we can do about that. What we do need to do is protect and safeguard those individuals who find themselves still able to do what they wanted to do. And part of the executive order and the proclamation was really getting our arms around our workforce and saying, who's in, who's out, what do we need to do for this? And also, Yvonne, to your point, the L visa has proved itself not to be as flexible or agile as perhaps we'd have first wanted or hoped for. And that's, there are so many different variables here. But predominantly, what it has meant is that 2020 and into 21, strategic visa planning is the most difficult it has been in the United States, which is already a very difficult jurisdiction to have that strategic planning.
Yeah, I have a
Ray,
question.
if I can build on that, just on Ray's comment regarding the discrimination issues, because that's the huge operational concern in the United States. It's not just discussing the visa restrictions, but taking into consideration somebody's visa status can bring up citizenship status, national origin, document abuse, discrimination, which are the protected classes under the U.S. Immigration and Nationality Act, not to mention other sections of the code regarding discrimination provisions. So you have to tread very lightly when it comes into discussing or considering immigration status in the hiring or promotion process internally. Just wanted to throw out there's a discussion point, that's all.
Yeah, we have a question if the L1B visa extensions fall under the current restrictions.
It does under the 10052 provision that was just processed on June 22nd, went to effect June 24th. So it does include L1Bs, which are basically categories under specialized knowledge workers.
Francis, do you want to talk a little bit more about Canada and what was that? I mean, this trend towards setting up in Canada and then day tripping executives or engineers into the United States. That happened before COVID. So was that an active approach from the Canadian government to develop business?
Yes,
Or,
it's different. Yeah, absolutely, Ivan. Yeah, so because there's no restriction whatsoever on some kinds of work permits in Canada. So, you know, the equivalent of the L Visa, which is the intra-company transfer in Canada, still work very well. The E-Visa, still the equivalent in Canada, still work very well. It's called the Own Operator Work Permit, Entrepreneur Work Permit. And also we have a special program also called the Global Talent Stream. It's basically for, you know, engineers, people in tech, and, you know, Canadian authorities process the work permits in as fast as 2 weeks. So they can come to Canada very fast. So of course, with all the problem with the H1Bs in the United States, the program has become very popular, and Canadian authorities are very collaborative with this program. So, you know, with this kind of work permit that you can have, you know, in as fast as 2 weeks, you can enter Canada very easily, even in the COVID situation, as long as you you put yourself in quarantine. So yes, definitely Canada has taken advantage of that.
and it actually manifested itself in additional foreign direct investment. You have the numbers to prove that it works?
Well, I don't have the exact statistics. I just have, you know, my firm as a reference, but we've seen in the last, I would say in the last few weeks, big surge in demand from Americans, definitely. They are looking for options, basically. And Canada is you know, sometimes is the obvious option.
Yeah. How about, I mean, the engineers that are trying to set up a manufacturing line or bring a machine over that an American company needs to manufacture, you know, ventilators or whatever it may be. Now, ventilators, they probably can because it's a medical emergency. You can make the case for that. But what about other machinery that is accompanied by an engineer? They can't come through Canada with or without the machine because you can't cross the US-Canadian border. We still have, what's the process there? Can I come from Canada into the US right now, or is that closed? And the same the other direction?
Well, from the US to Canada, you know, there are some exceptions. And one of the exceptions is that you have to come for an essential purpose, okay? And this is a pretty broad definition. So it's all a matter of documenting the reason you come to Canada. So if you document it, you say, you know, I really need to put this machinery, otherwise, you know, the business will be in trouble, and you have very good documentation on that. You know, the board agent should let you enter Canada because it's not, you're not coming just for fun, just for you know, going to your house, your vacation house. You're coming for an essential motive. So we had to be a little creative with that exception. You know, it's really there, and actually agents are pretty open. So far, the experience has been good. And again, as long as you come with a very strict quarantine plan, and they're gonna call you, and they're gonna want to make sure that you are still at home. They will make some verifications. You know, we had some clients who, you know, got the visit from the authorities. So it's something that can happen. It has to be taken very seriously.
Hey, Francis, this is George again. I mind if I interrupt? Not that this is a real fact pattern, but if you have somebody that's a U.S. citizen whose spouse is a senior executive with dual nationality, Canadian U.S., and the child is Canadian U.S., and the U.S. citizen child is Canadian U.S. citizen child is being dropped off by the U.S. citizen only parent, would that be considered essential under how Canada is interpreting essential, or does it have to be business essential?
You mean, can you repeat your question? You mean if someone from the United States come visit his family member in Canada?
Yeah, they're dropping off a child to go to university for the first time. as the rationale, rather than it being related to a board meeting in Toronto, for example.
Yeah, it would be considered as a valid reason. And of course, everyone with a student visa can enter Canada. So it would be considered as a valid reason.
Thank you.
Todd, you wanted to make a comment about some of your manufacturing members.
Sure. Yeah. Just to mention, I mean, we should not just, we think about the impact on the individual companies, but we should also think about the impact on employees. We have an Italian manufacturer that recently announced a major investment in the Cincinnati region, tens of millions of dollars, about 100 jobs are going to be created. One of their employees, one of their senior executives is planning to come from Italy, already has his E1 visa, but cannot enter the United States. 3 others are unable to get their e-visas because the consulate's closed. And the point is yeah, that's an impact on that company, but it's also an impact on those workers that might be hired. The company, this is a startup. This is brand new. They signed this deal about 1.5 years ago. They're in a very critical stage. So, the impact of this goes just beyond just the individual company, but also some of the employees.
You may want to make sure that company is alerted to the fact that when in the last week the U.S. Department of State has just announced that they're going to slowly start opening up the consulates around the world. It's hit or miss. It doesn't mean that every single consulate is going to open up at the same time or under the same conditions, but that is at least a very light at the end of the tunnel.
Oh yeah, we've shared that with them and continue to work with them on a daily basis.
Yeah.
Yeah,
we have to add a little bit of context on that very, very light. Like at the end of the tunnel, a number of UK visa application centres reopened, and then closed again last week. And I think we do have to acknowledge that is a possibility in this new normal, that visa application centres might open, they might close again. But I agree, it's very much a light when some of these application centres start to reopen in some of the embassies.
Yeah, we have a question here about an L1A. Options to travel to Europe and Brazil, but I'm wondering how they can come back. I think this may be, I don't know if we can add just a few comments on this, or this may be a follow-up that we have to do separately.
Definitely you're going to be, if you go into Brazil, you're going to be subject to the Brazilian exemption, and that creates another level of problematic. It's going to be very fact-driven. Where are they going to be, how long they're going to be in Brazil, how long they're going to be out of Brazil, what's the itinerary for their travel plans, and if that takes them to Europe, for example, or China, that's all going to have all different ramifications, because there is still a Chinese exclusion provision for entry from China at this point. And I don't think, because of politics, that's going to get any better. So it is very fact-driven, to be honest with you, Yvonne, from my perspective.
Yeah. So, Bert, we're gonna connect you with one of the speakers afterwards on this question, because this seems to be very specific. So, what are we gonna do now? How do we fix this? And I was thinking, it seems to be really advantageous to have multiple passports these days. Is that what it is? You need to, make sure that your family planning is multinational to address this. I don't know. I'm just throwing this out there.
Or you just have to come to Canada. It's a refuge.
Francis is a lucky man, because I know that Canada is getting a lot of inquiries, because I deal with that relationship with many U.S.-based clients and European-based clients that are looking at Canada as a really viable commercial option to the United States during these times. I see that all the time. I think it is something that, unfortunately, it is not just driven by health concerns, which is where all this started. I think it is driven by political motivations as well. And I think the elephant in the room from a pure U.S. perspective is that there is a U.S. presidential election. And I think every move that will be made by the current administration in reference to immigration visa issues, this is not a political statement, it's just a reality, is that it will be driven by political concerns. And this administration, I think, is not going to shy away from being more, is going to make it more open. I think it'll be going in probably the opposite direction. There is a lot of talk about that going in that negative direction.
George, do you think that a new president could change everything, or that some of the measures would stay in place?
I think there's some that will stay in place. I think there's certain provisions in place that I think might stay the status quo. But I think what we will get away from is the more, if there's a change in administration, if there is a change in administration, we'll get away from some of these more restrictive provisions, like this immigrant entry ban, which is green cards holders or processors, or non-immigrant visas such as the L, the H, the J restrictions, which really I don't see the commercial advantage. As a corporate immigration lawyer that represents companies and commercial enterprises, I don't see the commercial advantage to the United States from an internal perspective, why that would be good for the U.S. economy to restrict the brains behind the organizations to come in. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's just me.
That's what I'm seeing as well. I mean, there are real issues that companies are having with when they are thinking about setting up a dépendance in the United States, and they can't bring an executive over along with, with the know-how that this executive may bring to the table. And they obviously would bring one executive over and then hire additional people, but this is really delaying things, and especially since across Europe, you may not be a French person working at a French company, so but you're the ideal candidate. You may be Italian, then you don't qualify for the E-visa. So that creates all kind of problems with international expansion. I see the same thing. What I also see is with the H1B changes in the beginning, that the spouse can't work for the spouse of an H1B visa holder. That is a huge inhibitor for European executives coming to the United States, because European spouses work, both partners work, or it's very common that they both do, and they may not take the job if their wife or husband can't make it into the United States or work it there.
Right.
How is that addressed in Canada?
Oh, there's no restriction. I mean, the wife of someone, a skilled worker that comes in Canada, the partner has the right for an open work permit, so they can work for anyone.
Yeah. And
there's no restriction whatsoever.
Francis, after this call,
it works with. Sorry, George. I mean, it's and it works with common law partners too. You just need to prove that you've been, living together for at least a year.
Oh, wow. There's a question for you, Ray. Is the traveling spouse part of your workforce planning?
Yes, absolutely. Trailing spouse partners, dependent family members do form part of our workforce planning. This has been an HSBC standard really since I joined in 2011.
Yeah.
We spend a lot of time discussing various issues around that, and obviously there are particular nuances in the US, but we spent a lot of issues discussing that with the likes of the Permits Foundation, etc.
Yeah. It's, I'm still thinking that how this is affecting hiring decisions, because right. We talked about this at the Return to Work program last week. What if someone can't work at home? Am I more likely or less likely to hire them? In an organization like HSBC and some of our other members, if an employee is not suitable for my mobility strategy, because it's also how you train people, how they advance in their career. If they are, inhibited by their nationality and by their ability to obtain a visa, does that make me less likely to hire them? Or if they have a visa undesirable spousal arrangement? Is that a problem? I mean, this opens up all kind of other personnel and strategic planning questions.
But it also, these are age-old personnel and strategic planning questions around, do you want to have a visa that ties the individual to you? What do you do about supporting applications for green card or permanent residence? These are all things that, I think Jorge said it best, is very much a high wire on how you address some of these. Making a strategic planning decision based on nationality and immigration might help for one thing, but it will be taken away by another. And part of that is, I think immigration decisions as part of the strategic planning have always been very difficult, necessary, but very difficult. But yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we've had issues with, not only kind of hiring training spouses, but spouses of our employees themselves who found themselves outside of the US and unable to come back. That's been an issue for us over the last month, for example. Lots of quite concerned employees.
Yeah, we have a couple more questions. One is if we can talk about the national interest exception.
Yeah, maybe I can kick that off. I mean, again, going back to the July 16th communique from the Department of State in reference to the specific Schengen national interest exception, I've been getting a lot of calls from folks asking, well, there's been this new liberalization of the policy. Well, it's always been there. It's just not the liberalization. It's just reiterating the policy in essence. And they apply it to three different scenarios: humanitarian travel, national security concerns, or public health responses. My experience has been in funneling through these applications, they're concentrating, when they concentrate on public health, even though I had a senior executive that was involved in the logistics for a medical machinery that is helpful in the ventilator process, they were basically denied the visa to come back because they were not considered directly involved in the elaboration and development of that product. They were more involved in the tangential logistical side of it. So it's more times I'm seeing they want very specific, concrete examples of where they meet the exception, which is really at the total discretion of the consular officer, with no metrics or basically viable processes in place whereby you have to meet certain criteria to be able to meet that. It is really purposely made so it's open-ended, and part of that is legal. If it's open-ended under U.S. immigration law, a consular officer has absolute discretion to make a decision, and outside of abuse of discretion, they basically, their word is law. So it is it is an option that does exist, but I will tell you from a practical perspective, it is not something I would bet as a winning horse in basically being able to resolve this problem.
Yeah, it's the same at the immigration point, no? I mean, the border officer is has the ultimate say. If they don't like what's in your passport, you're out.
Absolutely.
Right.
That's a problem. We have another question for Schengen citizens with a U.S. work visa that need to travel back to the Schengen area to get their visa renewed. How is their return affected in the current climate?
Now, if we're talking, again, I'll kick it off because it sounds like a U.S. specific question, but if we're talking about it from the perspective of the visa entry restrictions that went into effect on June 22nd or June 24th, basically in that criterion, if they were physically in the United States on June 24th and they left for purposes of visa processing and they were in valid visa status in the HL or J visa category and they're going to extend it, they should be eligible to come back and be able to process the visa at the consulate. The key there is the consulate open to issue the visa stamp? That becomes a problem.
We have another one in the light of the presidential proclamation 10014, July 1st. What are the perspectives in the next couple of weeks or months?
Well, 10014 deals with the immigrant visa holders or green card processing. That was put on hold back in April. That was extended with the presidential proclamation that just dealt with the visa holders until December 31st. So at this point, they're in line with that being the process flow of how it gets applied until December 31st. And a change in administration, that will be something, Francis, for example, I could see a new administration changing right away and not extending. But that obviously comes into play that in January would be the presidential inauguration if there's a change in president. And that's when the policy would probably be affected. I think until that point, I wouldn't see any changes happening.
Okay.
Very good. I think we've reached our allotment in terms of time. It's 11 o'clock on the dot. Like I said before, if you have additional questions, I'll be happy to connect you with any of the panelists. And if you want to connect with other participants, let us know. We're here to make that connection.
That concludes today's webinar entitled Immigration Update, Visa Options for Europeans and Canadians in the Age of COVID-19 and in Light of Recent Developments. Thanks to our presenters, Francis Tourigny, Jorge Lopez, Gerlinde Wiskirchen, and Ray Rackham for sharing your experience and your insight. And thanks to all of you for joining in today's discussion. Just a reminder, all the comments and opinions presented by our speakers today are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the European American Chamber of Commerce or its members. Please stay in touch with your local chapter of the European American Chamber of Commerce for information on upcoming webinars and events. And be sure to look for a recording of this and other EACC webinars and events on our YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining us, and farewell.
Thank you, everyone.